And they did, in more ways than one. 6 months later, the land looked different, but in all the best ways. The casino developers had gone quiet, retreating into legal recalibrations, PR cleanups, and whispered settlements. Their towering blueprints now bent respectfully around my property instead of cutting through it. Where bulldozers had once loomed at the edge of my orchard, there now stood a public green space, officially named Grove, a park donated by the casino group as part of the negotiated settlement, and maintained by local volunteers who had once feared speaking up. Every Saturday morning, I'd see kids flying kites where excavation stakes used to pierce the soil. There were benches made of reclaimed wood, a community garden blooming with marigolds, and an old iron plaque mounted near the path that read, "This land stood its ground, so we could all stand a little taller." The HOA completely restructured. A full board election was held, and not a single seat went to a developer. Transparent bylaws were passed. The eminent domain clause was stricken permanently. Cassandra Lowe resigned quietly, her LinkedIn now listing consultant with no clients. The rumor was that she moved out of state. As for Richard Harmon, he faded into the background. Just another name in the newsletter no one reads. And my water rights? They were transferred into a community trust, just like I'd requested. The aquifer would serve not just me, but generations of families, schools, and farmers who called this place home. Every drop would be accounted for, every gallon protected. Even more unexpected, the scholarship fund, named after my wife, Mira's Light. The fund helped 3 local students, one of them the daughter of a single mother who had once served me coffee at the diner that wouldn't seat me during the height of the conflict. She hugged me with tears in her eyes when her daughter got into university. "You didn't just fight for yourself," she said. "You fought for all of us." That fall, Eleanor visited again, standing with me beneath the old fig tree that shaded the orchard. She looked out over the land, wind gently tugging at her blazer. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. "Not once," I said. "Every time they pushed, it reminded me why I had to stay." She nodded. "Your grandfather would be proud." I looked toward the rising sun, lighting the edge of the land in gold, and whispered, "I hope she is too." Sometimes people ask me what changed the outcome. Was it the lockbox, the lawyer, the media? And I always say the same thing. It wasn't one thing. It was knowing when to say no, when to say enough, when to stop being afraid of losing, and start remembering what's worth keeping. Because there are things you don't bulldoze, things you don't rewrite. And if you stand long enough, if you plant your feet and speak your truth, sometimes the land remembers who it belongs to. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when it mattered most. Because sometimes legacy isn't just about what we build. It's about what we refuse to let be taken. Thanks for watching. I stood barefoot on my front porch that morning, cradling a hot cup of coffee in my hands, watching the sunrise filter through the trees, like I had 100 mornings before. But today, something was wrong. The quiet hum of morning birdsong was replaced by the low, guttural rumble of diesel engines. I stepped forward, blinking against the glare, and what I saw made the mug slip from my fingers. Bulldozers. 2 of them, bright yellow machines, growling their way down the tree line, plowing directly into the edge of my land. Land I had walked with my father. Land I had cleared by hand. Land where my wife and I had planted an oak tree the day we brought our daughter home from the hospital. And now, that same land was being torn apart like it meant nothing. I stormed down the porch steps, my slippers catching on the gravel, heart pounding as I crossed the front yard. Workers in hard hats scattered across the property like ants. Spray painting lines, hammering stakes, setting flags where no flag had ever belonged. And at the center of it all, standing with one hand on her hip and the other holding a clipboard, was Cassandra Lowe. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a real estate catalog, mid-30s. Not a hair out of place, sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. "Good morning, Mr. Mara," she said, smiling without warmth. "Just making some progress on the development plan." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because beside her stood a man built like a brick wall, biceps bulging under a pale blue polo shirt embroidered with the words Summit Ridge Construction. His arms were crossed, chin lifted, like he was daring me to challenge them. "You're on my land," I said at last, my voice low. Cassandra gave a soft chuckle, tapping her clipboard with her pen. "According to the updated county survey, this parcel is now part of Silvergate Crossing's easement zone." "Updated when?" I asked. "Overnight." She didn't respond. The man, construction supervisor, foreman, hired muscle, whatever he was, took a step forward. "You're holding up progress, sir," he said, his tone cool and clipped. "These machines cost thousands every hour they're idle, and we're on a tight timeline." I glanced past him to the giant banners flapping just beyond the hill. "Future site of Silvergate Resort and Casino." The artist's rendering showed a sweeping complex, glass towers, artificial ponds, retail plazas, and a massive parking structure placed exactly where my orchard currently stood. My chest tightened. I'd been hearing whispers for weeks about development, expansion, big changes coming to the valley. The HOA newsletter had hinted, but never, not once, had anyone said they planned to take my land. I clenched my jaw. "You're making a mistake," I said quietly. Cassandra's eyes narrowed behind her designer glasses. "I don't think so," she replied. "You'll find our compensation offer very generous." I stared at her for a long moment. "You think I'm just going to roll over? Sell out? Walk away from the land I built with my own two hands?" "Honestly," she said, tilting her head, "we figured you might. Most do." I looked down at the flattened fence post under the treads of a bulldozer, the orchard trees that now stood in their shadow, the dirt I'd turned, planted, and protected for 35 years. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. What they didn't know, what they hadn't accounted for, was that beneath this ground ran something far more valuable than land, something they needed more than I needed their money. And without it, their multi-million-dollar casino project would never see the light of day. They had no idea who they were trying to push out, but they were about to find out. 35 years ago, I was just a 23-year-old with callous hands, a second-hand pickup, and a vision no one else could see. The land sat quiet then. 5 windswept acres on the outskirts of Red Bluff, a sleepy town in Northern California, known more for its walnut groves and its skyline. The property wasn't much, an overgrown field and meandering creek, but the moment I stepped onto that soil, I knew this was home. I scraped together every dollar I had, took out a loan so big the bank officer raised an eyebrow. Friends said I was crazy. My uncle said, "You're buying weeds and water, our June." Maybe so, but I saw something else. I saw where I'd build my house, with my own two hands. I saw the orchard I'd plant, the porch where I'd drink coffee at dawn, the treehouse my kids would one day climb, and the old oak where I'd stand proudly, giving my daughter away at her wedding. And over the next 3 decades, I made that vision real. Every nail in the beams, every stone in the foundation, I laid them myself, on weekends, on holidays, even after long shifts at the lumber mill where I worked those first few years. The creek became a quiet refuge where my son caught his first fish. The field became a garden, then an orchard, then a little slice of heaven my wife, and I would walk through every evening, hand in hand, while the sun dipped behind the hills. This land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was memories. It was roots. It was my legacy. When my wife passed away from cancer 8 years ago, I nearly sold it. The silence of this place, once comforting, became unbearable. But I couldn't do it, because every corner of this land still held her laughter. Her garden gloves still hung in the shed. The wind chime she insisted on putting by the kitchen window still rang on stormy nights. So I stayed, and now at 58, I was finally retired. I had plans, not for travel or fancy clubs, but to grow old in peace, to mend fences, read on the porch, and one day teach my grandkids how to plant their first saplings, just like I had. I knew the land was worth a lot. Real estate agents came by every year with big numbers and fast talk, but I always told them the same thing. It's not for sale. Not now. Not ever. Still, I watched as the town began to change. First came the strip malls, then a school, then an entire shopping plaza just 2 miles from my back gate. Then, about 6 years ago, came Silvergate Crossing, a shiny, upscale subdivision with its own gate, its own board, and its own promises of manicure perfection. When the county rezoned the area, my property was pulled into their HOA jurisdiction. I didn't protest. They said it was for road maintenance and community safety. Nothing would change, they claimed. My property, they assured me, was grandfathered in. I paid the small fees, went to 1 or 2 meetings. They smiled politely and left me alone for a while. Then came the clipboards, the passive, aggressive newsletters. And finally, Cassandra Lowe. She arrived 3 years ago. Young, polished, ambitious. The kind of person who wore heels to a community park cleanup. She'd stop by my property now and then, always with that bright, frozen smile. "Just checking compliance, Mr. Mara," she'd chirp, her pen already scratching notes. You know how it is, policies, paperwork, nothing personal. But it was personal, because I'd started to notice how her gaze lingered, not on my gutters or fences, but on the landscape. She'd ask subtle questions during these routine checks. "Have you ever considered downsizing, Mr. Mara? Maybe moving closer to family? This is an awful lot of land for one man." At first, I brushed it off. Just HOA nonsense. But in hindsight, I should have known. There was a plan brewing, quiet, calculated, and carefully disguised beneath the language of community improvement. And I was the only thing standing in its way. It began quietly, not with a bang, but a whisper. At first, it was just a couple of surveyors, standing along my eastern fence line one Tuesday morning. I spotted them to my kitchen window. 2 men in faded uniforms, hunched over tripods and waving long measuring sticks like they were divining water. No company logo, no formal introduction, just strangers with equipment on my soil. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, tried to keep my voice calm. "You folks lost?" I asked, walking down the driveway. One of them, a guy in his 40s with mirrored sunglasses and a clipboard, didn't even look up, just a routine check. Utility maintenance. "Utility?" I asked, glancing around. "There's no line work scheduled out here." "Who sent you?" "HOA authorization," he said flatly, then turned away. Something about the exchange didn't sit right. Maybe it was how they avoided eye contact. Maybe it was the way they kept checking their measurements against a set of very detailed blueprints, ones that included more than just utility lines. I should have pressed harder. I should have followed them to their truck. I should have demanded answers. Instead, I went back inside, chalking it up to another HOA formality. But that night, on my way home from the hardware store, I drove past the Silvergate Crossing HOA office, and something made me slow down. It was 7 p.m. on a weekday. The parking lot, normally empty by that time, was filled with 4 black SUVs and a Lexus with government plates. All the blinds were drawn tight, but through a narrow gap, I could see shadows gathered around a large table. A map or blueprint spread across it. Something was happening. Something I wasn't supposed to see. The next morning, I received a letter from the county assessor's office. Notice of property tax reassessment. My home's assessed value had jumped 40% overnight. 40%. My neighbors? A modest 5 to 7% at most. When I called the assessor's office, the clerk who answered sounded nervous, hesitant. She stammered something about regional development factors and revised zoning implications, then promptly transferred me to a voicemail that was never returned. That was the second red flag. The third came 2 days later. I found a bright orange violation notice tacked to my gate. The HOA claimed my garden shed, a structure I built 20 years ago, was non-conforming. That same week, I got 2 more. One for my fence, which now required architectural approval, and another for my mailbox, which apparently didn't match Silvergate Crossing's approved aesthetic palette. I hadn't changed a thing in decades, but suddenly, everything I had was a problem. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I drove to the HOA office, violations in hand, ready to clear the air. That's when I met Richard Harmon, the newly elected HOA president. He was in his early 50s, built like a retired linebacker, with the slick back hair and overly firm handshake of a man who'd spent just enough time in politics to be dangerous. He welcomed me with the kind of smile that's designed to put you at ease and immediately make you distrust it. "We're just bringing all properties up to code, Mr. Mera," he said, gesturing to the stack of violations like they were nothing more than parking tickets. "Now that we're entering a new phase of community development, well, the board wants everything to look unified." I stared at him. What kind of development? He leaned back in his leather chair, his voice going vague. Economic growth. Regional upgrades. Let's just say, some very exciting opportunities for Silvergate's future. The words didn't comfort me. On my way out, I paused near the door, just in time to hear Cassandra's voice in the hallway, muffled but clear enough. "Yes, we're proceeding as discussed. The Mera property is the only holdout. No, I don't anticipate significant issues." She didn't see me. She didn't know I heard. But in that moment, every piece began falling into place. The surveys, the tax spike, the sudden violations. This was coordinated, deliberate, and I was the target. I tried asking around, neighbors I'd known for years, but most looked away, muttered excuses, or shook their heads in apology. Finally, old Mr. Halvorson next door leaned in and said softly, they'd been having private meetings. Something about a developer. Big money. Big plans. But listen, those who ask too many questions, they end up buried in HOA violations. I raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying?" He looked around before answering. "I'm saying, if you want to keep your home, you'd better keep your head down, or sell while you still can." But selling? That was never an option. Not for me. Not for this land. Not for everything it stood for. 3 weeks later, the truth arrived not in a meeting, not in a phone call, but in the morning mail, buried between a hardware catalog and an electric bill. I tore open the paper like I always did, flipping straight to the business section, a habit left over from my working days. And there was bold headline, front page of the local business section, $300 million casino, resort approved for Silvergate Valley. Construction to begin within 30 days. I remember the moment like it was burned into my brain. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the kitchen tile. My hands shook as I grabbed my reading glasses and sat down, heart pounding. The rendering in the article showed a sprawling luxury complex, towers of glass, rows of palm trees, rooftop pools, valet turnarounds, underground parking. In the center of it all, unmistakably my land. The orchard, the creek, even my shed, scrubbed out and replaced with a decorative fountain. My stomach twisted as I read the fine print. Approved unanimously by the Silvergate Crossing HOA board. The article praised the projected jobs and tourism, called it a transformational economic opportunity, and quoted a developer spokesperson saying, "The community is fully aligned." I wasn't aligned. I wasn't even informed. That same day, I drove straight to the HOA office, newspaper clenched in my fist. I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I threw open the door and walked straight into a meeting already in progress. Cassandra Lowe, Richard Harmon, and a half-dozen men in dark suits, all gathered around a massive blueprint spread across a table. The look on their faces when they saw me, like I'd crashed a secret war room. "Emergency board meeting," Cassandra stammered, stepping in front of the plans. "Members aren't permitted during closed sessions." "Is that so?" I said, slamming the newspaper down onto the table. "Is this what you've been hiding? You're building a casino on my property." Richard gave a politician smile, the kind meant to disarm. "Now, Mr. Mera, let's discuss this calmly. There's no need for theatrics. You've been redrawing lines, sending fake violations, raising my taxes, and now you're selling land you don't even own." I snapped. One of the suited men stepped forward, slick hair, expensive watch, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mera, I'm Jonathan Lee from Apex Horizon Development. We represent the investment group funding the casino. We understand this may have come as a surprise, but we're prepared to make a very generous offer for your property. Market value plus 20%. We'd also relocate you to a luxury condo with no maintenance and full amenities. I stared at him. You think you can buy 35 years of memories with condo and a fruit basket? Cassandra's voice cut in sharply, her patience worn thin. Mr. Mera, the development is already approved. The board voted unanimously. Section 14, paragraph 2 of our bylaws. Eminent domain can be exercised for community economic enhancement. That's theft, I replied, heart pounding. That's not a community decision. That's a corporate land grab. Richard slid a paper across the table. It was in the newsletter, sir. All homeowners were notified. No objections were filed. I remembered the newsletter. A vague line about amendment votes buried between ads for landscaping services and bake sales. No mention of casinos. No mention of eminent domain. They had used my silence as consent. And now they stood there pretending this was business as usual. I turned to leave, but I paused at the door. One of the men whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Is he going to be a problem?" Richard's voice followed, low and chilling. "Nothing a few more fines and code violations can't fix. He's on a fixed income. He'll break." I didn't say a word. I didn't look back. But I clutched that paper so hard in my hand it crumpled under my fingers. And I swore, right then and there, they weren't going to break me. Not without a fight. The following morning, I was jolted awake by a deep, bone-rattling rumble. A mechanical growl that didn't belong in the peace of dawn. I threw on jeans over my pajama bottoms and pulled a hoodie over my head. No time for shoes. Just instinct and adrenaline. As I stepped outside onto my porch, the air was already vibrating with the low hum of heavy machinery. And there they were, 2 excavators and a bulldozer, parked right at the edge of my orchard, their massive frames crouched like predators at the border of my sanctuary. Orange construction stakes dotted the hillside, slicing a crooked line through the grass and 20 feet into my property. And standing among them was Cassandra Lowe, clipboard in hand, hard hat pristine, navy blouse tucked into designer jeans that had never seen a day of dirt. She stood beside a man I hadn't seen before, a thick-necked figure in his mid-50s wearing a pale blue polo shirt with Summit Ridge construction stitched across the chest. His arms were folded, his expression unreadable. I stormed down the porch steps, each one pounding like a war drum under my feet. What the hell is going on here? I shouted, voice echoing across the morning stillness. Cassandra turned to face me, her practiced smile already forming. "Mr. Mera, this is Mike Dawson, our site supervisor. We're marking property lines for preliminary excavation, just following county-approved development plans. My property line has been here for 35 years. I snapped, pointing to the rusted wire fence that had stood since before most of these homes were even built. You can't just redraw the map and move in with backhoes. Dawson stepped forward. He was taller than me by a good 6 inches and built like a battering ram. "Look, old-timer, the plans are approved. Every day we wait costs us thousands. The county line is what it is, not what you remember." My blood boiled. "This is my land. You're trespassing." Cassandra raised her clipboard like a shield. "We have full permits, Mr. Mera. We discussed this during our last meeting. You were served formal notice. The project is moving forward, with or without your cooperation." She might as well have said, "We don't need your permission." Neighbors were starting to emerge from their homes, gathering quietly on porches and driveways. I caught glimpses of their faces, concerned, conflicted, but distant, watching, silent. I stepped forward, planting myself between the bulldozer and my land. "Remove your equipment," I said, steadying my voice, "and take your stakes with you." Mike Dawson smirked, then leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "You know, accidents happen on construction sites, especially when folks don't know when to get out of the way." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. But inside, my heart hammered like a war drum. "Is that supposed to scare me?" I asked quietly. "Just an observation," he said with a wink. "You might want to take that offer seriously. It's the best you're going to get." What they didn't know, what neither Cassandra nor Mike could see, was that the entire conversation was being recorded on my phone, tucked into the breast pocket of my hoodie. Every word, every threat, every violation of ethics and decency. They thought I was alone. They thought I was out of moves. But the storm they were unleashing, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what lied beneath and what I was about to bring into the light. After the bulldozer confrontation, the line had been drawn, not just in the dirt, but in my resolve. I knew now they wouldn't stop, not with polite requests, not with fines, and certainly not with threats. But what I didn't know yet was how deep the corruption went. I needed help, allies, people who still believed in what was right, not just what was profitable. So I did what I hadn't done in years. I went door to door. My neighbors had lived on this street for decades, some longer than me, but suddenly I was a ghost, a threat, an inconvenience. Most would meet my eyes. They opened their doors just enough to be polite, but not enough to show solidarity. Only one person had the courage to speak. Mrs. Margaret Peterson, a widow in her 70s with more grit in her bones than any boardroom executive. Her front porch was lined with potted marigolds and a faded American flag. She didn't hesitate when I knocked. "Come in, Arjun," she said softly, usher me inside like family. "I've been expecting you." We sat at her kitchen table where she poured 2 cups of black coffee, no sugar, no cream. "You know they came after my garden last year," she began. Said my bird bath was too reflective. Called it a flight hazard. I nearly laughed in their faces. But then came the citations, the fines, the threats of liens. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "They're doing to you what they did to 3 other families before you. Quiet, slow, and deliberate." I asked her what happened to them. "Sold," she said simply. "All of them. Right before the reassessments and code violations magically vanished." Her eyes glinted. "But there's someone you need to talk to. Name's Jackson Reed. Used to be the county surveyor before he retired. Lives over on Maple Street, in that little white farmhouse with the red door. If anyone knows how they're playing games with those boundary lines, it's Jackson." I drove straight there. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the road, like arms trying to pull me back. But I kept going. When I knocked, the door opened slowly. Jackson Reed was 72, maybe older, with thick glasses and a voice like gravel. But his eyes were sharp, razor sharp, and when I explained what had been happening, he didn't blink. "Come in," he said simply. We sat in his study, surrounded by shelves filled with old topographical maps and dusty books. I laid out my deed, survey maps, and recent photos. Jackson spread them out on the table, tracing lines with a trembling finger, muttering to himself. "Here," he said finally, tapping one corner of the map. "This reference point. It used to be the old oak at Ridgewood Corner. But that tree was removed during the county's road expansion 5 years ago. And this," he pointed to the creek bend. "They redirected that waterway for drainage when the subdivision went in." My breath caught. "So without those landmarks, they can claim surveying errors," he finished, "and redraw the property lines as they see fit. It's legal, technical, and absolutely intentional." For a moment, I sat there in silence, rage tightening my jaw, betrayal churning in my chest. "So they erased my markers, then moved the lines?" He nodded. "It's not just land they want. Something's under there. And if they're willing to go this far, you've got something they can't afford to leave behind." That night, I stared out at my darkened fields, the orchard swaying gently in the breeze. The earth felt different now, not just soil and roots, but the battleground for something far bigger than I'd imagined. They wanted me gone, but now I wanted the truth. And I would find it, no matter how deep I had to dig. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind reeled with maps, survey lines, and Jackson's quiet warning. They're not just after the land. It's what's under it. I sat on my porch long after midnight, listening to the wind slide through the orchard like an old friend trying to whisper something I hadn't heard in years. The trees creaked, the stars blinked, and in the silence, my mind drifted to her, Mira, my wife. She would have known what to do. She always did. Practical, patient, but sharper than anyone ever gave her credit for. Whenever I was too stubborn, she had a way of softening the edges, of seeing 2 steps ahead. I don't know what pushed me up out of my chair just before 2 a.m., maybe grief, maybe instinct, but I walked out the old tool shed near the rear of the property. It hadn't been touched much since she passed. Dust lay thick on the windows, and the smell inside was accompanying scent of rust, soil, and memories. I reached up to the top shelf, where she used to keep things I never bothered to go through, and that's when I found it, a metal lockbox, scuff-heavy, and sealed shut with rusted clasp. I nearly laughed. Mira was always squirreling away important things just in case. I grabbed a screwdriver from the wall and pried it open, expecting old recipes, photos, maybe her parents' birth certificates. But instead, I found the key to everything. Inside were papers, some yellowed, some brittle, and all meticulously organized. Deeds, survey records, letters between my grandfather and the county from the 1930s. And then, tucked beneath a folded handkerchief, I saw it, a thick document with a gold embossed seal that read, Water Rights Adjudication, Clearwater Basin. I blinked, reading the first line twice to be sure. It wasn't just a water access permit. It was something far more powerful. Control rights, signed and sealed in 1937. It granted my grandfather exclusive, perpetual authority over the use of the underground aquifer running directly beneath my property, and detailed provisions that prevented any industrial or recreational development from altering its flow without express written permission from the landowner. My heart kicked into overdrive. This was no small spring. According to the attached geological maps, this aquifer was Clearwater Basin, one of the largest and cleanest underground water sources in the county, and the primary reserve for everything within a 10-mile radius. I remembered stories my grandfather used to tell, how the city had once tried to run pipelines through his orchard, how he'd fought them in court and won. I had assumed it was just local legend, but this wasn't legend. It was law. As I kept flipping to the lockbox, I found something else, a faded leather-bound journal, his handwriting still elegant despite the years. I sat on the shed floor, back against the wall, and read page after page. Developers want the water, not the land. Without the basin, they can't grow. They'll come for it. Remember this always. And suddenly, I understood why they were so desperate to push me out, why the lines had been moved, why the violations piled up, why they needed me gone before the first trench was dug. Because that casino, with its fountains, pools, landscaping, hotels, and hundreds of guests, it would need millions of gallons of water to survive. Water they couldn't touch without me. And I had no intention of signing a single dotted line. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like a man on the edge of losing everything. I felt like a man holding the one card that could bring an empire to its knees. At sunrise, I stood at my kitchen table, lockbox open, documents fanned out like cards in a gambler's final hand. But this wasn't about luck. It was about leverage, and I finally had it. The rights, the maps, the geological surveys, and my grandfather's foresight. It was all here. A legacy not just of land, but of legal armor forged decades ago. And I knew one thing for certain. This couldn't wait. Within the hour, I was on the phone with every water rights attorney I could find within 200 miles. Most were booked. Some didn't return my calls. One offered a sympathetic shrug and told me quietly, HOAs are hard to fight, developers even harder. But then came a voice that didn't flinch. Eleanor Jimenez, a water law specialist from Sacramento, who had made her career taking on municipalities, ranchers, and real estate giants alike. When I told her what I had, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. You're telling me you have original pre-zoning control rights to Clearwater Basin? She asked slowly. That's what it says. Dated 1937. Signed, sealed, filed, with geological overlays to prove the aquifer sits under my land. Another pause. Mr. Mara, do not speak to anyone else. I'll be there tomorrow morning. She arrived in a silver SUV, businesslike, sharp-eyed, and straight to the point. We laid out everything on the dining table, me standing over her shoulder, watching her lips move as she flipped through each page. She didn't say much at first, just nodded occasionally, marking things with small tabs. These documents are solid, she said finally. Extraordinary, actually. You have perpetual authority over water usage rights for the basin. Not just access, but veto power over any industrial development that could impact the flow. And this, she tapped the aquifer easement. This is gold. It's a restriction that predates modern zoning law, which means any attempt to build over that aquifer, casino or otherwise, has to go through you, legally. I blinked, barely daring to hope. So I can stop them? Eleanor looked up. Her expression wasn't soft, but it was reassuring. You can stop them, or better yet, force them to their knees before they lay a single brick. That afternoon, we began filing emergency injunctions against the HOA, cease and desist orders for the construction company, and most importantly, a petition to the State Water Resources Control Board asserting my grandfather control over the basin. Eleanor drafted each motion with the precision of a scalpel. She wasn't just fighting for me. She was fighting with me, shoulder to shoulder, like we were back-to-back in the trenches of some old-world legal battlefield. She also had me do something I hadn't thought of. Request full transparency from the casino developers, water usage projections, drainage schematics, groundwater disruption models, all things they had likely buried or forged to slide past public scrutiny. By nightfall, the paperwork was filed, the legal grenades tossed. And for the first time in this whole ordeal, they were the ones playing defense. I stood on my porch that evening, holding the lockbox in my arms like it was a family heirloom, and it was not just paper and ink, but resistance wrapped in legacy. The orchard swayed gently under the fading orange sky, and I could feel the weight of generations standing behind me. The bulldozers had retreated. The developers were scrambling. And Cassandra Lowe? She was about to find out that the man she tried to evict wasn't some helpless retiree on a patch of forgotten land. He was the gatekeeper to everything they needed, and I wasn't moving. The next morning, everything changed. What had started as a quiet legal maneuver behind closed doors exploded into the daylight. Eleanor's filings had triggered automatic injunctions, and by mid-morning, a uniformed court officer was standing at the edge of my orchard, handing a cease-work order to a flustered construction foreman. It was like someone had thrown a wrench into a spinning machine. Engines idled. Excavators fell silent, and the crew stood frozen, whispering nervously. I watched it all unfold from my porch, arms crossed, heart steady. Across the street, neighbors began to peek out from behind curtains, drawn by the sudden quiet that followed weeks of rumbling machines and tension. But that wasn't the biggest blow. Because that same afternoon, I got a call from a local reporter, a young woman named Priya Desai from Channel 6, who'd caught wind of the injunction through a court monitor. "Mr. Mehra," she said, "is it true you're the one holding up the casino with a water rights claim?" I hesitated. I had never sought attention, let alone media exposure. But as I looked out over the orchard, the same land that had raised my children, buried my wife's rose garden, and carried the last of my family's roots, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Yes," I told her, "it's true, and I've got the paperwork to prove it." She was at my house within an hour, camera crew in tow. As I sat on my porch, microphone clipped to my shirt, I told my story, not with anger, not with drama, but with calm, deliberate truth. I showed her the lockbox, the water rights documents, the HOA citations, and the evidence of tampered boundaries. I told her about the surveyors, the threats, the manipulation of my land, and how the very people entrusted with protecting the neighborhood had secretly partnered with developers to destroy it. She asked if I was afraid. I told her, I'm not afraid of bulldozers. I'm afraid of what happens when people stop standing up for what's right. The segment aired that night. By morning, it had gone viral, first locally, then statewide. Retired man stops $300 million casino with 85-year-old water rights. Small town giant. One homeowner's battle against HOA corruption. Clearwater Basin belongs to the people. The headlines poured in. So did the messages. Hundreds of them. From farmers, teachers, veterans, and families. People who'd lost their homes to eminent domain. People who'd been bullied by HOAs and developers. People who'd been told they were in the way. My story had given them something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, Even more unexpected was what began happening in my own neighborhood. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact were now stopping by with pies, handshakes, and quiet apologies. One couple brought over their teenage son and said, "We just want him to see what it looks like when someone stands their ground." Old Mrs. Peterson knitted me a scarf that said, #WaterWarrior. She made 24 and handed them out at the grocery store. The Save Clearwater Basin Facebook page, which Eleanor had quietly launched, ballooned over 25,000 followers in 72 hours. Environmental groups reached out offering legal and financial support. A retired hydrologist volunteered to testify about the aquifer's fragility, and the state's environmental board issued a request for a formal review, suspending the casino's water access application pending further investigation. The developers were stunned. For weeks, they had operated in the shadows, quietly cutting deals, redrawing lines, rigging the game. But now, every move they made was in the spotlight, and their one-slick confidence was starting to fray. Cassandra Lowe tried to do damage control. She issued a memo calling the report sensationalized and my claims technically obsolete. But it was too late, because the tide had turned, and the man they thought they could push off his land, he wasn't just a holdout anymore. He had become the front line. The courtroom was packed, not just with attorneys and officials, but with neighbors, environmentalists, retirees, reporters, and families who'd driven in from 2 counties over. By the time I arrived, walking slowly up the courthouse steps with Eleanor beside me and Jackson Reed just behind, a quiet buzz filled the air. News cameras flanked the sidewalk. Microphones were thrust forward. Questions flew like arrows. "Mr. Mara, is it true the casino threatened to build overprotected water? Do you plan to settle? What are you hoping the judge will decide today?" I said nothing, not because I didn't have something to say, but because the time for words would come later. Right now, we had work to do. Inside, the atmosphere felt like a powder keg, silent, tense, electric. On one side sat our small team, me, Eleanor, Jackson, and 2 community advocates. On the other, Cassandra Lowe, tight-lipped and composed, Richard Harmon, newly rehired as consultant, Mike Dawson, arms crossed like a bouncer outside a club, and a fleet of attorneys from Grand Crest Holdings, Apex Horizon, and the Casino Group, all wearing suits so sharp they could cut glass. At the bench was Judge Lillian Patel, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with silver streaks through jet-black hair and a reputation for cutting through corporate theatrics like butter. When she entered, the room rose. When she looked up over her glasses, the room held its breath. "This hearing," she said, her voice calm but commanding, "concerns claims of fraudulent land reclassification, improper use of HOA authority, environmental concealment, and legal control over Clearwater Basin aquifer resources." She glanced at both sides. "You will speak truthfully. You will keep it professional. And you will remember that this court answers not to lobbyists, but to the law." It began with Eleanor. She laid out our case with clarity and quiet power. No dramatics, just fact after undeniable fact. The deed records, the historical water rights, the geological overlays, the redrawn property boundaries, the unvoted HOA amendments, and the altered environmental reports. Then came Jackson, who explained how surveying markers had been deliberately removed, how the boundaries were falsified to reroute ownership under cover of regional alignment. When Cassandra took the stand, she tried to charm. She spoke in polished phrases and called me respected and beloved in the community. But when Eleanor cross-examined, it unraveled. "Ms. Lowe, prior to managing Silvergate HOA, where were you employed?" Cassandra hesitated. "Landmark Urban Developments, which is owned by Apex Horizon, which also owns the Casino Group, correct?" "Ah, yes." "And you were hired weeks before the casino submitted their first land application, yet you failed to disclose this connection to the board or community?" I didn't think it was relevant. Murmurs filled the room. Then came Harmon. When pressed on the HOA's eminent domain amendment, he finally cracked. "Yes, okay?" We pushed it through fast. Quietly. We didn't want backlash. The deal was too good. He looked right at me then, shoulders sagging. "We didn't think you'd fight it." Then Eleanor stood once more. She revealed the original environmental impact study, the one buried and replaced with a falsified version. This, she told the court, holding up the faded report, is the truth. The casino would drain Clearwater Basin dry within 5 years. Wells would fail. Farmland would die. And the ecosystem would collapse. And they knew it. Silence. A silence heavy enough to shatter. Judge Patel took a moment before delivering her verdict. This court finds, she began slowly, that the HOA's amendment was enacted under false pretenses, without informed consent from its members, and in coordination with private entities whose interests directly conflicted with their duty to homeowners. She turned to me. Mr. Mayor's water rights are valid and enforceable and supersede all zoning designations post-1937. All construction is hereby suspended until a full review is completed. The HOA's eminent domain claim is nullified. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but a wave of whispered gasps, disbelief, and stunned silence. I looked at Eleanor. She smiled, not wide, not triumphant, but the kind of smile that said, "We did what needed to be done." Outside, the reporters descended again. But this time I spoke. I didn't fight to be a hero. I told them. I fought because this was my home. Because this land holds my family's past and this community's future. What happened here isn't just about one old man with a deed. It's about standing your ground. About saying, "No, you can't take this from me just because you have money and lawyers." This time the roots held.